All right, the first book that I would like to talk about is A Wild Sheep Chase by Haruki Murakami. This was the first book that I read this year, and it was a wild introduction to 2023. It's such a weird book. I got this book when I went to Japan last summer, and I held off on reading it for a long time because I wanted to have a book from Japan that I could save and read later. And so I decided at the beginning of the year that this would be a good book to start the year with. And man, it is so weird but so awesome. Okay, so the book follows a man as he slowly becomes involved in this conspiracy where there might be a magic sheep ruling the world, and he's trying to find the sheep. It's just as weird as it sounds, but it's so much fun. It's a bit disturbing at times, but overall I would describe it as charming and whimsical with, just a sprinkling of eerie disturbingness. Much like Murakami's other work, it deals a lot with postmodernism, meaninglessness. One of the main themes is that this guy, the main character, his job as in this advertising firm is basically meaningless, and so he goes on this adventure in part to find the sheep and complete this quest or whatever, but also in part I think just to illustrate that if there's nothing meaningful, then we might as well do the most ridiculous thing ever, find a magic sheep. So I really liked that book. And I went on to read more of Haruki Murakami's stuff later on in the year, but I'll talk about that in a minute. The next book that I read was The Truth About Keeping Secrets by Savannah Brown. I have followed Savannah Brown's work for many years now. She's a YouTuber, an author, poet, person, and I think she's really cool. But I'd never read any of her stuff other than the things she posted on YouTube and whatnot. And so I finally decided I'll read one of her books. That sounds like fun. And I really liked it. I can definitely see, if you've seen her videos, I can definitely, there's a lot, the lyrical, poetic style that she talks in during her videos and her poetry is definitely conveyed in her prose, because this book, The Truth About Keeping Secrets, is sort of a young adult fiction, realistic fiction, and I really liked seeing her style of writing in this format. I will say that the actual story, it's about a girl who lives in a small town in Ohio, and her dad dies, and there's a bit of mystery around her dad's death, and then she meets this girl and they become really good friends, and then things happen. So the story itself, like I was gonna say, is kind of stereotypical. It doesn't really cram in that deep of a message or a theme or whatever. I don't think it was trying to be super deep. So she obviously knew what she was going for when she wrote it, and she did a good job executing that. And like I said, I really liked her style. The next book I read was The Good Earth by Pearl Buck. This book was so interesting to read. Probably one of the first books I've ever read where I got genuine culture shock reading it. I've read books from all sorts of different cultures, but this is the first book that I've read where I was genuinely shocked by the enormous cultural differences, just in the way that the characters think and act. The book follows this guy Wang Lung. He starts as a poor farmer in rural China during the late 19th, early 20th century, and then he sort of moves up in society, and the book is about his journey and his family's journey from poverty to becoming pretty wealthy. And so just the way that he looks at the world and the way that he moves through the world is so completely different from any other character that I've ever read about. And it was really interesting to see those differences. But also the similarities and the universality of the nature of life and the way that he thinks and acts is different, but the way that he feels about things and the way that his life moves and is shaped by other events that are out of his control, I think is very, I can't say relatable. It was universal. That's what I can say. The next book that I read was Olive, again by Elizabeth Strout. Just a bit of backstory for this. This is the sequel to Olive Kitteridge, and I read Olive Kitteridge 2 years ago for a summer writing class that I took. That was like our assignment, was to read one chapter of that book every day and then write something sort of based on that. And I really loved Olive Kitteridge. And so when I found out that there was a sequel, I was immediately hooked. I was like, I'm going to read that. And it's amazing. It's a great sequel. I love Olive Kitteridge as a human being. She's amazing. Her perspective on things and the way that she moves through the world is deeply relatable. Even though I'm 65 years younger than she is, I just love her so much and everything. The most amazing thing about Elizabeth Strout as an author is her ability to create these deeply relatable characters and yet also illustrate clearly how flawed they are as people. And I think that's her most powerful ability as an author, is the way that she's able to illustrate a person in their totality, right? The amazing things about them and their deep flaws, their insecurities, the whole person. And that's really powerful and really important, I think, and something that's especially important today when it seems like as a society we spend so much time purposefully trying to misunderstand each other, to paint each other as heroes or villains, when really everybody's just human, and that's how it goes. So I loved Olive again. If you haven't read Olive Kitteridge, the first book, you absolutely need to, and then this is a great sequel to that, so I really enjoyed it. The next book I read was another Murakami book, which was South of the Border, West of the Sun. If anybody watching has like any recommendations for other Murakami books, I'm totally down to read them. I didn't really get a good sense of like what to read next. Like, I know Norwegian Wood is famous and I know IQ84 is really famous, but I didn't really feel up to those. So I read this one, and it is even more postmodern meaninglessness. I think it illustrates way more than Wild Sheep Chase, sort of the stifling like productivity culture that has sort of taken over many parts of the West, including Japan, like a sort of lack of individualism. It's about this guy who grows up and he meets this girl and he really likes her and they're friends, and then they move to different schools and he loses touch with her, and he sort of like narrates like the direction that his life goes after losing contact with her, and towards this like boring, sterile life that has no meaning or purpose. And you know, it's not a bad life. Like, he has a good job and he has a wife and he has children, but he's just bored with everything and nothing satisfies him. And then he meets the girl again from his childhood and things happen and blah blah blah. But that was the most powerful impact that this book had on me, was the meaninglessness part. I don't know, I feel like I've only read a couple of his books, but Haruki Murakami, seems like to me the emotion that he is the best at illustrating is meaninglessness, which is great and all, but it means that I probably shouldn't read all of his books in a row, because that would just make me depressed. Which is a great transition to the next book that I read, which was A Gentleman in Moscow. This book, I need to do an entire video just on this book at some point, and I've tried to write the script for that video, and I need to keep working on it. But this book is the exact opposite of meaninglessness. This book is filled with so much meaning and purpose and value and just delight for life. It follows this Russian nobleman, the bourgeoisie, I guess, and he, after the Russian Revolution, he is placed under house arrest in the Metropole Hotel which is in Moscow. And he basically has to live in this hotel for the rest of his life. He can't leave the hotel. And so he decides that with his exile, he's going to become a man of purpose, and he's going to like figure out how to live the best life that he can live within the confines of this exile. And he is completely successful. That's not really a spoiler, but it's just a great example for me as a person of like how to navigate hardship and how to navigate things going wrong and failure and whatnot, of like it is possible to create happiness for yourself and create meaning for yourself regardless of external factors. And I think that this book is really valuable and everybody should read it. So yeah, go read it. The Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. The next book I read, this was the first book I read this year for like English class. I read The Great Gatsby, which was a reread for me. I read The Great Gatsby last year. I talked about it a bit in my last book video, like my all the books I read in 2022 video. And I did not rewatch that video in preparation for this, but I remember not liking it, and I'm pretty sure that's what I said in my last video. But upon rereading it, I actually kind of like this book more now. Like, I saw a lot more of the complexity that this book has, and after reading it, because we had to read it for class, after reading it we had to write an essay about it, and I sort of got really into like all of the different theories and lenses that can be applied to this book. And yeah, I might also do a dispatch or a video on this at some point, because my theory that I came up with for my essay that I'm very happy with is that Nick Carraway is not actually a character in this book. But I'll talk about that some other time maybe. So yeah, I liked The Great Gatsby more so this time than last time. The next book that I read, which I also read for English class, was Death of a Salesman, which isn't a book, it's a play, but I'm counting it. And I really liked this way more than Great Gatsby. A couple years ago, around the same time that I read all of Kitteridge, I got really into listening to Everywhere at the End of Time, which, if you don't know, is like a 6-hour long piece of music that's on YouTube that like simulates, or is supposed to simulate, like dementia, the different stages of dementia as you like start forgetting things. And so all the songs, which are like remixed 1930s era songs, all of the songs start off pretty clear, and then they get more and more muffled as you go through different stages, and by the end it's just literally white noise. And I was completely obsessed with that for a while, and I listened to it all the time, which is probably creepy and a red flag, but I had a good time. And also, I watched the movie for Death of a Salesman after I read it, and I love Dustin Hoffman. But this book, if you didn't know, this play deals with basically dementia, or, you know, old age. And the main character, Willie Loman, is basically losing his mind. And his children completely failed to support him, and he's just sort of like reliving all these moments of his past where he failed and stuff. It's sad, it's depressing, but it's also just a really well written play, and I really liked it. So yeah, the last book that I'm going to talk about, the book that I've most recently read, is Orlando by Virginia Woolf. Now, I've talked about Virginia Woolf books in the past. I read Mrs. Dalloway last year. That was one of the books that I read. And the year before that, I read To the Lighthouse. I'm very proud of myself because this is the longest Virginia Woolf book that I've read, and it's also the Virginia Woolf book that I've read the fastest. It took me like 6 months to get through To the Lighthouse just because that book is so confusing, and I guess I was not as good of a reader back then. It took me about a month to get through Mrs. Dalloway. I think that was in part because the entire book of Mrs. Dalloway is like one chapter long, and I don't like books like that. I like chapter breaks that help you pace yourself. But I read Orlando in under 2 weeks, so I'm very happy about that. And this is also my favorite Virginia Woolf book of the 3 that I've read. Orlando is basically about a trans woman, but that wasn't acceptable when Virginia Woolf wrote it in the 1920s, and the language for that didn't exist at the time. But it's also about like an immortal person, sort of. So Orlando, the person, at the beginning of the book is like a nobleman. He's like 16 years old in 16th century England, in Elizabeth I's like court in England. And then by the end of the book, she is a 36-year-old woman in London in like 1928. And so the book follows them over the course of their life. In the beginning, as I said, he's just a kid in England, and then he goes to Turkey to be the ambassador for England. And then while he's in Turkey, he just decides, and there's like, it's amazing. I really liked how Virginia Woolf like handled it, considering the time period she was writing this in. Like, she makes it sort of like a theatrical moment where like the muses like come in, the angels come in, and they're like singing a song, and then Orlando wakes up and she's like, I'm a woman now. And then the book just progresses without really addressing the external impact of that, and more talking about the internal side effects of that. And I also really liked the way that Virginia Woolf dealt with the passage of time and like death in this book. I thought it was really creative. I've been kind of obsessed with like the idea of like an immortal person or like a centuries old person for a really long time, and I love the way that she handled it. Basically, like, over the course of the book, as people would die, Orlando would just suddenly remember them, like long after they had died, and be like, oh wait, I should talk to that person. Oh no, they're dead. Oh wait, I could talk to this person. Oh no, they're dead. Never mind. Oh, because in the beginning of the book, Orlando's like an angsty teenager, basically. And so every single thing around him is observed and noted, and it's much slower. Like, I think the first half of the book takes place within just a couple of years of time. And then the second half like speeds through like 300 years. And then by the end, Orlando is like living in a complete daze. Like, the things that are happening around her, she doesn't really take notice of them because she's so lost in the memories that still exist in her head of like times that have long since passed. I mean, I can't say it's realistic because nobody has ever or probably will ever live that long, but I just thought it really felt profound to me reading it. Like, oh yeah, this is how it would work if you were 300 years old, because you would have so much rich life inside of you that the outside things happening around you would pale in comparison to it. And yeah, so I really liked Orlando, and I'm going to take a break from Virginia Woolf just like I did last year, but I'll definitely read more of her stuff in the future, because she's growing on me over time the more of her books I read. Anyway, so yeah, I hope you liked me talking about books. I hope you liked the birds that I painted. This is a weird video, but I'm glad you sat through it if you're still watching. So yeah, go read some books. Let me know what you're reading. If, like I said before, I don't know if I said this, but if you have any suggestions of Haruki Murakami books to read, I would like those. I will get to them eventually. But I just don't really know what order to go in from here. I've read Wild Sheep Chase and South of the Border, West of the Sun, and I would like some suggestions of what to go for next. Anyway, yeah, so bye.